Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Shadow Storyteller. Before we dive into tonight's story, don't forget to subscribe, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comment below. I'll be bringing you more late night stories that will keep you company before you fall asleep. Now, let's begin. The long bus ride from Dallas to New Orleans and the woman beside me. It was the summer of 2019 on a humid July afternoon in Dallas, Texas. The Greyhound station on Lamar Street was filled with restless travelers, each of them carrying their own stories in the form of heavy bags, tired eyes, and conversations overheard in fragments. I remember glancing at the departure board around 2:30 p.m., the letters flickering slightly on the screen, confirming that my bus to New Orleans would leave at 3:15. I had been awake since dawn, partly because the Texan heat had been unbearable in the small motel room I rented the night before, and partly because my mind was crowded with too many thoughts. I was traveling alone, heading to New Orleans for reasons that I couldn't fully explain to anyone without unspooling a complicated thread of personal history. The bus arrived late, closer to 3:40, its long silver body reflecting the harsh afternoon sun. People shuffled into a line, tickets clutched in sweaty hands. I boarded and found my seat somewhere in the middle near the window. The seat beside me was empty, and for a brief moment, I felt relieved. I thought I would have the quiet comfort of solitude during the long ride eastward. But just as the driver was checking the last tickets, a woman stepped in. She must have been in her late 30s, maybe early 40s, wearing a loose denim jacket despite the heat outside. Her auburn hair was tied loosely at the back, strands falling to her cheeks, and her eyes carried that unmistakable look of someone who had been moving from place to place for too long. She scanned the rows, noticed the empty seat beside me, and made her way toward it. "Mind if I sit here?" she asked, her voice soft but with a faint rasp, as if she'd been speaking too much, or maybe smoking on the platform moments earlier. "Of course, go ahead," I replied, moving my backpack closer to the window. She settled in, exhaling deeply as if she had just finished a race. The driver's voice came over the intercom, reminding us of the safety rules, and then, with a jolt, the bus pulled out of the station. Dallas began to blur past the window. Highways, overpasses, billboard half, faded under the sun. For the first hour, neither of us spoke. She sat with her arms crossed, occasionally leaning her head against the window, while I watched the Texan landscape flatten and stretch endlessly, dotted with gas stations and small towns whose names barely appeared on the map. There was something calming about the rhythm of the road, the way the bus hummed steadily forward. It wasn't until we stopped near Shreveport, Louisiana, around dusk, that conversation began. The bus station there was small, with a faint smell of fried food lingering in the air. People rushed out to buy snacks or stretch their legs. She and I stayed seated for a while, until she turned slightly toward me. "You're heading all the way to New Orleans?" she asked, her accent hinting at somewhere southern but not quite local. "Yeah," I said. "You too." She nodded. "Been a while since I've been there. Not sure what I'll find when I get back." There was a weight to her words, something that made me curious but also cautious. The kind of statement that could open a door to a long story or shut it firmly if you pressed too hard. Her hands fidgeted with the strap of her bag as she spoke, and I noticed a faded tattoo on her wrist, the outline of a bird that seemed almost erased by time. When we finally pulled out of Shreveport and the sky turned indigo, she began to share fragments of her journey. Her name was Claire. She told me she had been living in Houston for a few years, working different jobs, none of which lasted long. She laughed at herself when she said it, but the laugh was short, almost nervous. The bus interior had grown quieter by then, most passengers dozing off or listening to music through cheap headphones. The overhead lights cast a dim glow, and outside the windows the world was reduced to shadows and occasional flashes of headlights on the highway. Claire's voice carried in that muted space, soft and steady, as though the bus itself had become a confessional. She told me about her younger brother who had once lived in New Orleans, about a falling out dated years ago, and how she was now returning with the fragile hope of mending something that had been broken too long. There was something almost cinematic in the way she spoke, as if the city wasn't just a destination, but a place where parts of her past were waiting, unresolved, maybe even unforgiving. As the miles stretched on, I found myself not just listening, but drawn into the texture of her life. the pauses in her sentences, the silence between details she chose not to share. And somewhere between Monroe and Baton Rouge, in the heavy silence of night, the bus moving like a slow heartbeat on the empty highway, I began to realize that this woman beside me, this stranger named Claire, was not just another passenger passing through. She carried a story that was pulling me along with it, as if the journey to New Orleans had suddenly become more than just my own. The hum of the engine became the background to everything, steady and almost hypnotic. Some passengers had already slipped into deep sleep, their heads leaning against windows or falling awkwardly on the shoulders of strangers who didn't bother to push them away. The air inside the bus was a mixture of recycled coolness from the air conditioning and the faint traces of perfumes, snacks, and unwashed clothes. Claire shifted slightly in her seat, pulling the denim jacket tighter around her. Even though the bus wasn't cold, it seemed as if she wanted to shield herself from something invisible, not just the air. She rested her head against the backrest, eyes fixed ahead, but I could sense she wasn't fully at ease. I decided to break the silence. "So, you haven't seen your brother in how long?" She breathed in before answering. 7 years, maybe 8. Last time I saw him was at our father's funeral in Baton Rouge. We argued about things that seem small now, but at the time, it felt impossible to forgive. The way she said it made me think about my own family, the grudges I'd held, the conversations I avoided. Family conflicts have a way of cutting deeper than anything else, because the people who hurt you are the ones who know you best. "And you're hoping to see him again now?" I asked. Claire gave a half-smile that didn't reach her eyes. "If he'll let me. I heard he still lives somewhere near the French Quarter, working in one of those old bars. A friend told me he never left New Orleans after Katrina. Stayed when most people ran. Said the city became part of him." She paused. "I don't even know if he'll want to see me, but I have to try." Her words hung in the dim space between us. I didn't push further. Sometimes stories unfold only at their own pace. Outside, the Louisiana night deepened. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, lined with thick forests that looked like shadows pressed against the horizon. Occasionally, a neon sign from a roadside diner would flash by, glowing faintly before disappearing into the dark. The bus seemed like a capsule suspended between places, carrying lives that intersected for a moment before scattering again. As the night went on, Claire began to open up more, not in long explanations, but in fragments. She told me about her years in Houston, moving from apartment to apartment, working as a waitress, then in a call center, then in a thrift shop. "Nothing ever stuck," she said. "I always had this feeling I wasn't where I was supposed to be, like I was just waiting." I asked, "Waiting for what?" She looked at me, her eyes reflecting the faint overhead light. "For something that feels like home." Her answer lingered, simple yet heavy. It was a kind of sentence that could mean everything or nothing, depending on who was listening. We fell into another stretch of silence. The bus rocked gently with the road, and the sound of rain began to tap against the windows. I hadn't noticed a storm gathering until then. But soon lightning flashed faintly in the distance, illuminating the sky for a moment before fading. The driver slowed slightly as the rain grew heavier, the windshield wipers moving back and forth in a steady rhythm. Passengers stirred, some annoyed by the change, others too deep in sleep to notice. Claire pulled her knees up slightly, curling into her seat. She spoke again, almost to herself. "My mother always said I had a restless spirit. That's why I left home so quickly after school. I thought moving from place to place meant I was free. But now, I'm not sure if I was escaping freedom or chasing it." Her voice was low, thoughtful, and I realized she wasn't really talking to me, but to herself. The bus had become her confessional again. We rode in silence for a long time, the rain pattering against the windows, the night highway stretching endlessly. I began to drift in and out of half-sleep, the kind where you're aware of every bump in the road, every shift of the person beside you. At one point, I felt her head lean slightly toward my shoulder, just enough to brush against it, and then settle there. I didn't move. She seemed exhausted, her breathing evening out, and I thought about how strange it was how two strangers had ended up side by side, sharing moments of quiet vulnerability on a bus in the middle of nowhere. When dawn began to break, Faint light spilled through the windows. We were somewhere past Baton Rouge, the sky painted in soft shades of gray and pale orange. The bus stopped at a small station where passengers stumbled out, stretching and yawning. I stepped outside for a moment, breathing in the damp morning air, heavy with the smell of wet asphalt and pine trees. Claire stayed inside, her head resting against the window. From the outside, I could see the reflection of her face in the glass, peaceful in a way she hadn't looked the night before. Back on the bus, as we rolled toward New Orleans, she woke and smiled faintly. "Did I fall asleep on you?" she asked. "Only for a little while," I said. "Don't worry about it." She looked away, embarrassed but also grateful. Then she said, "I don't usually talk this much to strangers, but it feels easier on the road, you know? Like none of it will matter once we arrive." I nodded. Maybe that's why people tell their stories to strangers. They can leave them behind afterward. She considered that for a moment, then turned back to the window, watching as the scenery began to change. Swamps appeared, bridges stretched over still water reflecting the sky, and the architecture of houses shifted to something distinctly southern. The closer we got to New Orleans, the more she seemed to retreat into herself, as if bracing for something ahead. By the time the skyline of the city appeared in the distance, with its mix of old church spires and modern buildings, the atmosphere inside the bus had shifted. Passengers gathered their bags, anticipation filling the air. For me, it was just another destination, another place to pass through. But for Claire, it was something else entirely. Her hands tightened around the strap of her bag, her expression caught between nervousness and resolve. She whispered, almost as if to herself, "I wonder if he'll even open the door." I wanted to say something comforting, something that might ease the weight she carried, but the words didn't come. Sometimes silence is better than promises you can't keep. The bus pulled into the New Orleans station around 9 o'clock in the morning. The air was thick with humidity, carrying the smell of coffee and beignets from a cafe nearby. People rushed off, greeted by friends or family, while others disappeared quickly into the city streets. Claire and I stood awkwardly near the platform, the moment of parting hanging between us. She gave me a small smile, tired but genuine. "Thank you for listening," she said. I nodded. "Safe travels, Claire. I hope you find what you're looking for." She hesitated, then extended her hand. I shook it, feeling the firmness of her grip. And then, just like that, she walked away, disappearing into the crowd with her denim jacket and auburn hair. I stood there for a moment longer, the noise of the station filling the space she left behind. Then I picked up my own bag, stepping out into the streets of New Orleans, with the weight of her story linger with me. A story unfinished, unresolved, yet somehow now a part of mine. The air in New Orleans wrapped around me like a damp blanket. It was only 9 in the morning, but the humidity already pressed down with the weight of midday. I stepped out of the station onto Loyola Avenue, the sound of the city rising all around me. Car horns, distant jazz drifting from somewhere I couldn't see, and the chatter of tourists pulling their suitcases across uneven sidewalks. For a while, I simply stood there, not sure where to go. My motel wasn't far, maybe a 15-minute walk through the central business district, but my mind wasn't on my own plans. I kept replaying the brief exchange with Claire at the station, her voice lingering when she whispered about her brother. She had walked into the crowd and vanished quickly, yet her presence still clung to the morning air like the echo of a song you can't shake off. I decided to walk. My bag wasn't heavy, and walking through a city is always the best way to feel its pulse. The streets were a mixture of old and new, glass buildings casting shadows over brick facades, streetcars rattling by on tracks that seemed to belong to another century. Every few blocks, the smell shifted. Strong coffee near the cafes, fried dough coated with sugar near the bakeries, then the briny scent of the Mississippi River whenever the wind turned. At the motel, I checked into a small, worn room with a creaking ceiling fan and curtains that didn't quite close. I dropped my bag on the bed, but rest felt impossible. The city outside called, restless and alive. And beneath that call, another thought tugged at me, the unfinished thread of Claire's story. I wandered back into the streets, letting the flow of people guide me. Eventually, I found myself near the French Quarter, where the architecture shifted to colorful balconies draped with ironwork, and music seemed to seep out of every open doorway. Street performers played violins and trumpets, their cases open for coins. Tourists gathered around, clapping in rhythm, cameras flashing. I bought a cup of strong coffee from a corner cafe and sat outside for a while, watching the world move. Yet, my thoughts circled back to Claire. She had said her brother worked in one of the old bars around here, somewhere near the quarter. It wasn't much of a clue, but it narrowed things down. The hours passed slowly, the sun climbing higher, the heat becoming almost unbearable. By early afternoon, I found myself walking along Bourbon Street, where the energy was louder, more chaotic. Bars stood shoulder to shoulder, each spilling music into the street, neon signs glowing even in daylight. It was a carnival that never seemed to end. I stepped into one of the quieter bars, the kind with wooden floors that creaked and walls lined with faded photographs of musicians long gone. A man behind the counter looked up, wiping a glass with a rag. He was in his 40s, with sharp features and tired eyes. I ordered a drink, something cold just to take the edge off the heat, and we exchanged a few words. I hesitated before asking, but curiosity pushed me. Do you know if a guy named David still works around here? I heard he's been in the quarter for a long time. The bartender raised an eyebrow. David who? You'll have to be more specific. There are a few. I shrugged, pretending it was casual, not sure the last name. Someone mentioned he used to play in bars like this. The man thought for a moment, then shook his head. Could be a couple people. You'll find more answers if you keep asking around. That's the thing about New Orleans. Everyone knows someone. I thanked him and left, but the seed of curiosity had grown deeper. I didn't know why I was chasing this, why Claire's story mattered to me more than it should have. Maybe it was the way she had spoken, the quiet fragility in her voice when she said she wasn't sure her brother would open the door. Maybe it was because, in that moment on the bus, she had become more than a stranger. She had become a mirror to something in myself I hadn't yet named. By evening, the city transformed again. Lights flickered on, street musicians grew louder, and the corridors swelled with people. I sat on a bench near Jackson Square, the cathedral towering white and solemn behind me, the river shimmering nearby. Couples strolled past, children ran with balloons, and artists set up their easels under the street lamps. And then, among the movement of the crowd, I thought I saw her. Claire. She was across the square, standing uncertainly near the steps of the cathedral, her denim jacket still clinging to her shoulders despite the heat. She looked smaller somehow, more fragile against the backdrop of the lively city. I hesitated, unsure if approaching her was the right thing. Maybe she wanted to be alone. Maybe she didn't want a reminder of the bus ride. But before I could decide, she turned slightly and her eyes met mine across the square. Recognition flickered, followed by something like relief. She walked over slowly, as if still deciding whether it was a good idea. I didn't think I'd see you again, she said softly when she reached me. I wasn't sure either, I replied. But here we are. She glanced around at the crowd, then lowered her voice. I tried to find him. Someone said he might be working in a place down by Decatur Street, but I couldn't bring myself to walk in. Not yet. Her admission carried a weight heavier than the humid night air. I could see the conflict in her, the push and pull between hope and fear. She wanted to see her brother, yet she was terrified of what his reaction might be. Do you want to go with you? I asked, the words surprising me even as they left my mouth. She looked at me for a long moment, her eyes searching mine, as if to decide whether she could trust the offer. Then she nodded, just once, a small gesture that carried enormous weight. And so, we walked together through the streets of New Orleans, the night alive around us, carrying a story that was still unfinished, still uncertain. Every step closer to Decatur Street felt heavier. The sound of music followed us, blending with laughter, the clinking of glasses, the endless pulse of the city. Somewhere ahead, behind the door of an old bar, a man named David might be waiting, unaware that his sister had crossed miles and years to stand before him again. And beside her, a stranger who had once been just another passenger on a long bus ride was now caught in the tide of her journey, carried forward into the unknown. The night in New Orleans wrapped itself around us like a living thing. Every corner we turned seemed to reveal another layer of sound, smell, and movement. Jazz spilled from open doors, the sharp notes of a trumpet mixing with the deep thrum of a bass. Laughter rose and fell like waves, sometimes joyous, sometimes harsh. Street lamps flickered yellow against brick walls damp from earlier rain. Claire walked half a step ahead of me, her arms folded tight across her chest, the denim jacket clinging despite the heavy heat. Her pace was steady, though I could see in her eyes that each block felt heavier than the last. I didn't ask her questions now. I knew enough to sense that silence was its own form of support. We crossed Royal Street, then Chartres, weaving through groups of tourists and locals. Vendors were selling beads, masks, and paintings under makeshift stalls. A young man with dreadlocks played a saxophone at the corner, his notes slow and aching, like a song about longing itself. Claire paused for a second, listening, and I thought I saw her eyes glisten before she quickly looked away and kept walking. By the time we reached Decatur Street, the energy shifted again. It was still loud, still alive, but the faces seemed less polished, more worn. The bars here were older, their signs faded, their doors heavy with the weight of years. Some windows glowed warmly. Others revealed shadowy interiors filled with the silhouettes of drinkers hunched over wooden counters. Claire slowed, glancing left and right. Her breathing had quickened, though her steps remained deliberate. Finally, she stopped outside a narrow building with a dark green facade and a hanging sign that read The Lantern House. The lettering was chipped, the wood weathered. From inside came the faint sound of live music. Not the loud brass of a street band, but a softer, bluesy guitar accompanied by a low voice. She stood still, staring at the door as if it were a wall she couldn't climb. I waited beside her, not saying anything. After what felt like minutes, she spoke, her voice barely audible above the street. "This is it. Someone told me he works here, bartending in the evenings. I don't know if I can," she trailed off, shaking her head. I touched her elbow lightly, just enough to let her know she wasn't alone. "You don't have to decide right now. We can sit somewhere close by, get a drink, watch the place from across the street until you're ready." Her eyes darted toward me, filled with both fear and gratitude. She nodded, and we crossed over to a small cafe with outdoor seating, one of those places that never seemed to close. The chairs were metal, a little uneven on the cracked pavement, but the view faced directly toward a lantern house. We ordered 2 coffees, bitter, strong, served in chipped mugs. The waitress didn't linger, moving quickly to other tables. Around us, the city hummed on, but for a moment, the cafe felt like an island where time slowed. Claire wrapped her hands around the mug, though she didn't drink. "I haven't seen him since the funeral," she said quietly, as if speaking only to herself. "I told him things I regret. Things I never thought I'd regret at the time. He told me never to come back, and I believed him." She paused, her gaze fixed on the bar across the street. "But then I heard he stayed here, that he never left. And I thought, maybe if he can love a city enough to stay through everything, maybe he can love his sister enough to forgive." Her words struck me in a way I hadn't expected. There was something raw in them, something that pressed against the parts of me I kept hidden. I thought of my own estranged connections, the calls I hadn't made, the apologies I had buried under years of silence. The minutes stretched on. People came and went from the bar, the door swinging open to release bursts of music and laughter before closing again. Finally, around 10, the crowd seemed to thin. Through the window, I glimpsed a man behind the bar. His hair was dark but streaked with gray, his shoulders broad, his movement steady as he poured drinks and wiped counters. Claire's breath caught. Her grip on the mug tightened. "That's him," she whispered. "That's David." She looked frozen, as if the sight of him had turned her into stone. Her face was pale, her lips pressed tight, her eyes locked on the figure behind the counter. I leaned in slightly. "You can do this. Whenever you're ready. I'll be here." She didn't answer immediately. Then, slowly, she placed the mug down, stood, and adjusted her jacket. Her legs trembled slightly, but her back was straight. She crossed the street without looking at me, as though if she hesitated for even a second, she would turn back. I followed a few steps behind, stopping near the doorway but not going inside. I wanted her to have this moment, unshadowed by the presence of a stranger. Through the open door, I saw her step into the dim interior. The music was low now, just the soft strum of guitar from a man sitting in the corner. David looked up from behind the counter, his eyes flickering with recognition. His face hardened immediately. He froze with a glass in his hand, then set it down slowly. Claire stood a few feet away, her arms at her sides, her body trembling but her gaze steady. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The bar seemed to quiet, as though even the walls leaned in to listen. Finally, David broke the silence, his voice sharp but low. "What are you doing here?" The words cut like a blade. Claire flinched, but she didn't back down. "I came to see you." He shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping. "After all these years? After what you said at Dad's funeral, you think you can just walk in here?" Her voice cracked, but she held it steady. "I know I don't deserve it. I know I left when you needed me most. But I've carried that regret every day. And I can't carry it anymore without telling you." The room was silent. Even the guitar had stopped. People at the bar turned their heads, watching, sensing something important unraveling. David's face softened for a moment, then hardened again. "You hurt me, Claire. You made me feel like I was alone. And I stayed here in this city trying to build something from the ruins. And now you come back. What? Looking for forgiveness?" Tears welled in her eyes. She nodded. "Yes, I'm not asking for much. I want to be your sister again." He stared at her, his jaw tight, his eyes searching hers as though weighing the years of anger against the trembling sincerity before him. The silence stretched unbearably long. I stood outside, heart pounding, feeling like an intruder on something sacred and painful. The city's noise swirled behind me, but inside that bar, it was as if time itself held its breath. At last, David's shoulders slumped. He sighed deeply, almost like a man surrendering. He didn't smile, but he didn't turn away either. Instead, he gestured toward an empty stool at the bar. "Sit down," he said quietly. "We'll talk." Claire exhaled sharply, a sob escaping before she covered her mouth. She stepped forward slowly, as though afraid the moment would break if she moved too quickly. I stayed where I was, just outside the doorway, knowing my part in her story was not to step further in, but simply to bear witness to the fragile bridge being built again between brother and sister. The rain began again, light at first, tapping against the street. The air smelled of wet stone and magnolia. Somewhere nearby, a trumpet started to play, its notes rising into the night, mingling with the sound of reconciliation just beginning inside the lantern house. And I realized then that the long bus ride from Dallas hadn't just brought me to a city. It had brought me into the orbit of a story that wasn't mine, but would stay with me forever, etched into the rhythm of New Orleans and the faces of two siblings who had dared, after so many years, to open the door to each other again. The bus rumbled deeper into the dark Louisiana night, its headlights cutting through stretches of pine trees and small roadside towns that seemed to be sleeping under the weight of humidity. Somewhere between Baton Rouge and the long stretch toward New Orleans, the woman beside me shifted again, drawing a shawl tighter over her shoulders. The air conditioning was blasting cold, making the entire bus feel like a refrigerated box, though outside, the night air pressed heavy with warmth. I leaned my head slightly against the window, trying to rest, but the rhythm of the bus kept pulling me back into fragments of thought. Every so often, I caught the faint reflection of her face in the glass. Her name, I had learned earlier in the ride, was Margaret, though she insisted I call her Maggie. There was something in the way she introduced herself, half formal, half playful, that lingered with me. She seemed to be the kind of woman who carried more stories in her silence than in her words. At one point, the bus made a brief stop in a tiny Louisiana town. A flickering neon sign above a gas station announced its presence, and a small diner sat beside it, its windows glowing faintly yellow. The driver announced we had 10 minutes. Most passengers stayed in their seats, too tired to move, but Maggie stood up, stretched, and asked softly if I wanted to join her to stretch our legs. Her voice was calm, inviting, without expectation. I nodded, grateful for the chance to escape the stagnant cold of the bus for a moment. The humid night air wrapped around us the second we stepped outside. Crickets hummed in the distance, and a faint smell of fried food drifted from the diner. Maggie walked slowly, her hands clasped behind her back, as if savoring the ground beneath her feet after too many hours of stillness. She turned to me, her face illuminated by the glow of the neon sign, and asked why I was going to New Orleans. I hesitated before answering, partly because I wasn't entirely sure myself. I told her I needed a change of scenery. That Dallas had begun to feel like a city closing in on me. Too many routines, too many unfinished chapters. She listened without interruption, her eyes holding mine in that steady way that made silence feel comfortable rather than awkward. When it was her turn, she said she was traveling to New Orleans to visit her sister. She isn't well, Maggie admitted, her voice softer now, and I don't know how much time we'll have left. There was a weight in her tone, one that made me realize how heavy her shawl must have felt, not from fabric, but from memory. I didn't push for details. Instead, I nodded, the crickets filling the spaces between us, as if they were carrying the words we didn't say. Back on the bus, the atmosphere felt different. Conversations had quieted, lights dimmed, and the rhythmic hum of the road lulled some passengers into uneasy sleep. Maggie settled back into her seat beside me, pulling the shawl up near her chin. For a while, we sat in silence, the only sound the occasional call from someone at the back or the faint static from the driver's radio. After some time, Maggie spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. She told me about her childhood in Lafayette, how the summers were unbearably hot, but full of music, food, and laughter. She mentioned a small wooden house her father had built by hand, where she and her sister would spend evenings chasing fireflies. As she spoke, I could hear not just nostalgia, but quiet longing, an ache for a time she knew she could never return to. The bus continued to roll, crossing bridges that seemed endless, their steel frames rising like skeletons in the night. Below, dark water stretched into silence, reflecting only fragments of moonlight. I felt caught between worlds, between my life in Dallas that I had left behind and whatever awaited me in New Orleans. Maggie's presence beside me anchored me in that moment, her stories weaving a bridge between the uncertainty of my future and the weight of her past. At one point, the bus passed through a patch of road where fog clung thick, swallowing the headlights until the driver slowed to a cautious crawl. The passengers stirred, some pressing close to the windows, others closing their eyes as if trusting the fog to guide us. Maggie reached into her bag and pulled out a small thermos, unscrewing the lid carefully. The faint aroma of chamomile filled the air between us, soothing in its simplicity. She offered me a sip. I accepted, the warmth surprising against the cold that had settled into my hands. That small gesture, sharing something so personal, something meant a comfort, felt oddly intimate. I thanked her, and she smiled, the kind of smile that lingers after it's gone. Hours passed this way, in fragments of stories and stretches of silence, until the faint glow of a city began to rise on the horizon. It was still dark, the kind of pre-dawn hour where time feels suspended, neither night nor morning. New Orleans awaited with all its noise, color, and unpredictability. But for the moment, the bus remained a world of its own, sealed off, intimate, floating on wheels across bridges and highways. Maggie shifted once more, leaning her head gently against a window, her eyes closed, her breathing steady, though her hand rested loosely near mine on the seat between us. I stared ahead, my own thoughts a blur, and wondered how much longer the ride would last. Not just in miles, but in the strange connection that had taken root in the quiet hours of this journey. The bus slowed again, approaching another stop before entering the heart of the city. Somewhere in the dimness, a baby cried softly, soothed quickly by a tired mother. A man 2 rows ahead muttered in his sleep. And beside me, Maggie stirred, her eyes opening just enough to catch mine. "We're almost there," she whispered, her voice carrying both relief and something else, something that made me think she wasn't quite ready for the bus ride to end either. The road stretched ahead, the first hints of dawn touching the sky with faint traces of gray. And as the bus rolled on, I realized this journey was becoming more than just a passage from one city to another. The bus glided into the outskirts of New Orleans as the first fragile light of dawn crept into the sky. The air outside was thick with humidity, and even through the sealed windows, I could sense the difference. The night fog was thinning, replaced by a soft mist that clung to the edges of street lamps, and the world began to take on that peculiar gray-blue tone that belongs only to mornings not yet fully awake. Inside the bus, people stirred as if drawn by some invisible signal. Bags shifted, jackets were pulled tighter, and conversations started in low murmurs. The driver's voice crackled through the intercom, announcing that we would reach the station in less than 20 minutes. Maggie straightened in her seat, pushing back the shawl from her shoulders. She smoothed her hair absent-mindedly, her fingers brushing through the loose strands that had fallen during the night. She caught me watching and offered a faint, tired smile. "Almost there," she said again, her tone lighter now, though I could hear the weight of anticipation beneath it. I nodded, suddenly aware that our journey together, whatever strange intimacy it held, was nearing its end. I wasn't sure how to feel about that. The silence between us wasn't awkward. It had taken on a quality of its own, something closer to understanding than absence. The bus curved onto a wider road, and suddenly the skyline appeared in the distance. Buildings rose against the pale sky, some modern, some weathered with age, their windows catching the first hints of morning. The city wasn't awake yet, but it was breathing, preparing itself for another day. When we finally pulled into the Greyhound station, the bus hissed as it came to a halt. Passengers rose in a slow shuffle, stretching limbs that had been confined too long. Overhead compartments creaked open, bags were pulled down, and the aisle filled with bodies eager to step outside. Maggie stood, adjusting her shawl, and turned to me. "Do you have somewhere to go right away?" she asked. I hesitated. The truth was, I had no clear plan. I had booked a small room at a guest house near the French Quarter, but beyond that, my days in New Orleans stretched blank before me, waiting to be filled. "I've got a place," I replied, "but I'm not in a rush." "What about you?" She gave a small laugh, one that didn't quite hide her nerves. "My sister lives across town. I'll take a cab there." "But," she paused, eyes drifting past me for a moment before returning, "would you like to have coffee first, before we part ways?" The invitation hung in the air, simple yet carrying more weight than it seemed. I found myself nodding without hesitation. We stepped off the bus together, greeted instantly by the heavy air of New Orleans. The humidity wrapped around me like a blanket, a stark contrast to the icy chill of the bus. The station was already buzzing despite the early hour. Families reuniting, drivers calling out, vendors setting up small carts of food and drinks. Maggie led the way toward a small cafe tucked beside the station. Its neon sign buzzed faintly, casting a soft pink glow over the sidewalk. Inside, the air smelled of strong coffee and buttered bread. The place was quiet, occupied only by a few early risers hunched over their mugs. We found a corner table by the window. Maggie ordered tea, while I asked for black coffee. The waitress moved with the slow rhythm of someone who had been awake too long, her voice raspy but kind. For a few moments, we sat in silence, listening to the clink of cups and the hum of the refrigerator behind the counter. Then Maggie began to speak, her words tumbling out more freely than they had on the bus. She told me about her sister, whose health had been declining for months. "She was always the stronger one," Maggie said, tracing the rim of her cup with her finger. "And now I'm supposed to be the strong one. I'm not sure I know how." Her honesty struck me. There was no pretense, no attempt to disguise the vulnerability in her voice. I wanted to tell her something comforting, but the truth was, I didn't have the words. So instead, I listened. When our drinks arrived, she sipped her tea slowly, her eyes fixed on the rising sun outside. The city was beginning to wake. Cars rolled past the cafe, and a man with a saxophone case slung over his back crossed the street. "I grew up not far from here," she said suddenly. "Every street feels like a memory. Some sweet, some not so sweet. Leaving was easier than coming back." I could sense the conflict within her, the pull of home and the weight of what awaited. And yet, there was also resilience in her eyes, a quiet determination I hadn't noticed before. After we finished our drinks, Maggie glanced at the clock on the wall and sighed. "I should go," she said. "My sister will be waiting." I nodded, though a part of me wasn't ready for her to leave. We walked out together, the air now brighter, streets humming with life. A line of yellow cabs waited along the curb. Maggie stopped, turned to face me fully. "Thank you for keeping me company," she said. "The ride would have felt much longer without you." "And thank you," I replied, "for sharing your stories, for the tea." She smiled, the kind of smile that stays with you, then raised her hand in a small wave before stepping into a cab. The door shut, the engine hummed, and just like that, she was gone, disappearing into the flow of the city. I stood for a moment longer, watching until the cab was out of sight. The streets of New Orleans stretched before me, alive with possibilities. Yet my mind kept circling back to the woman on the bus, the shawl around her shoulders, the quiet strength in her voice. With my bag slung over my shoulder, I began to walk, the rhythm of the city guiding my steps. The air carried the faint scent of coffee and fried dough, mingling with the sound of distant music. And though I didn't know what the days ahead would bring, I carried with me the memory of a long ride tonight, and the stranger who had, for a brief time, felt like something more than a stranger. The story was not finished. Not for her, not for me, not for the city that now surrounded me. The morning sun in New Orleans grew brighter as I stepped farther from the bus station. The city was waking slowly, like a body stretching after a long night's sleep. Street vendors pushed carts across uneven sidewalks, their voices calling out in a mixture of English and French patois. A jazz melody drifted faintly from somewhere down the street, carried on the humid air that wrapped around me like a second skin. I had checked into a modest guest house near the French Quarter, a 2-story building with peeling paint, but a welcoming charm. The owner, an older man named Joseph, handed me a brass key and told me to enjoy the sounds of the city. My room overlooked a narrow street where wrought iron balconies dripped with flowers and laundry hung lazily in the rising heat. I dropped my bag on the bed, splashed cold water on my face, and let the open window invite the city inside. But even as I stood there, taking in my surroundings, my thoughts kept circling back to Maggie, the way she had held her cup of tea at the cafe, the way her voice had softened when she spoke of her sister, the almost imperceptible hesitation before she stepped into the cab. Our journey together had lasted less than a night, and yet it had carved out a space in my mind that felt strangely permanent. By late morning, I wandered into the French Quarter. The streets were alive with color, painted shutters in shades of turquoise and red, street performers tuning their instruments, artists setting up canvases near Jackson Square. The aroma of beignet and chicory coffee wafted through the air, mingling with the sound of horse hooves pulling carriages along cobblestone streets. I found myself drawn into Café du Monde, where I ordered coffee and a plate of sugar-dusted pastries. The cafe buzzed with energy, tourists snapping photos, locals talking in rapid French-laced English. As I sat at a small green table, I caught myself scanning faces and crowd, wondering irrationally if Maggie might somehow appear again. She didn't. Instead, I lingered, letting the city seep into me. My mind wandered to the idea of calling her, though I realized I had no way to reach her. No phone number, no address, only her name, her stories, and the memory of her shawl brushing against my arm on that long bus ride. That evening, the quarter transformed. Gas lamps flickered to life, casting soft pools of light across the streets. Music spilled from every corner. Blues, jazz, brass bands marching through narrow alleys, their horns echoing off old brick walls. I walked without direction, letting the sound lead me, until I found myself near a small bar tucked between 2 antique shops. The place was dimly lit, with wooden floors that creaked underfoot. A woman with a velvet voice sang to the accompaniment of the piano, her words floating above the low hum of conversation. I ordered a drink and settled into a corner, the day's weight pressing into me. As I listened to the music, I thought again of Maggie. I imagined her across town, sitting beside her sister, maybe holding her hand, maybe talking about the days when they were children catching fireflies in Lafayette. I wondered if she, too, was thinking about the stranger she had shared a bus ride with. The night grew deeper, and I returned to my guest house with the sound of the piano still echoing in my ears. Sleep came in fragments, broken by dreams of moving highways and passing headlights, of her voice saying almost there in that soft tone that lingered like a shadow. The next morning, I decided to visit the Garden District. The streetcars rattled along St. Charles Avenue, their green paint chipped but proud. The oak trees arched overhead, branches heavy with moss, casting dappled light across grand old houses with wide porches. I walked slowly, my eyes drinking in the mix of beauty and decay that seemed to define the city. At a small bookstore on Magazine Street, I paused. The air smelled of old paper and dust, the kind of place where time felt slower. I browsed the shelves without intention until I noticed a book left open on a wooden table. An anthology of Louisiana poetry. Something about it reminded me of Maggie, her quiet way of speaking, her stories rooted in this very land. I bought the book, telling myself it was just a souvenir, though I knew it was more than that. It was a way of holding on to the thread that connected us, however fragile. Days passed in this rhythm. I explored the city by day. Markets, riverboats, old cemeteries with their white stone tombs rising like islands above the earth. By night, I followed the music, letting it carry me deeper into the soul of New Orleans. And yet, no matter where I went, a part of me remained tethered to that bus ride, to the woman who had shared it with me. One afternoon, as I sat on a bench by the Mississippi River, watching barges drift lazily past, I heard footsteps approach. I turned, and for a moment, my heart stumbled. It wasn't Maggie, but the disappointment I felt confirmed something I had been resisting. I wanted to see her again, not just in memory, not just in passing thought, but in reality. I wanted to know how her sister was, whether she was finding strength in the city that had shaped her, whether she still carried that same shawl over her shoulders. The city around me pulsed with life. Street musicians playing for coins, children chasing pigeons, couples walking hand in hand. I sat there, the river rolling endlessly beside me, and realized that my time in New Orleans was no longer just about escape. It had become about searching, for her, for meaning, for the possibility that a fleeting connection could become something more. The thought stayed with me as the sky turned orange with sunset. The air grew heavy again, promising rain. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled faintly, and the first drops began to fall, speckling the pavement with dark circles. I pulled my jacket tighter and stood, deciding I could no longer wait for chance alone to bring her back into my path. There were places she might go, places she had hinted at in fragments of conversation. A house in Lafayette from her childhood. Memories of music, of fireflies, of summers too hot to bear. And of course, her sister's home, somewhere in this city, waiting quietly in a neighborhood I had yet to discover. I didn't know where to begin, but I knew I couldn't stop now. The long bus ride from Dallas to New Orleans had ended, but the journey it sparked was only beginning. And so I stepped into the rain-soaked streets, the sound of jazz rising in the distance, the city alive with secrets waiting to be found. Rain slicked the streets of New Orleans that evening, the kind of rain that seemed to come not from clouds above, but from the air itself, heavy and relentless. Umbrellas bloomed like dark flowers along the sidewalks, and water gushed down into gutters, carrying with it the day's discarded flyers and leaves. I pulled my jacket tighter, though it did little to keep me dry, and wandered aimlessly through the quarter. The music hadn't stopped. Even in the downpour, brass bands played beneath awnings, their trumpets blaring defiantly against the storm. People gathered in clusters, clapping, laughing, moving their bodies despite the wet. The resilience of the city struck me, how it refused to fall silent, how it insisted on dancing even when the sky opened up. I ducked into a small tavern on the corner of Royal Street. Inside it smelled of beer, wet wood, and fried seafood. A jukebox hummed faintly, though most of the sound came from the chatter of patrons escaping the storm. I ordered a bowl of gumbo and sat by the window, watching rivulets of rain blur the neon lights outside. As I ate, I couldn't stop replaying the brief moments I'd shared with Maggie. Her voice, her gaze, the shawl draped across her shoulders like armor. I realized I had learned so little about her, and yet she lingered in me as though I had known her for years. That unsettled me. Connections weren't supposed to work that way. Not with strangers, not with chance encounters. And yet here I was, stirring a spoon through thick broth, imagining what she might be doing at that very moment. By the time the storm passed, the streets glistened under gas lamps. Puddles reflected the glow of shop windows, and the air carried that post-rain scent of earth and stone. I wandered toward Jackson Square, where artists had returned to their easels, painting damp canvases with quick, confident strokes. The cathedral loomed ahead, its white spires piercing the dark sky like sentinels. I stopped near a man sketching portraits for tourists. His hand moved swiftly, capturing lines and shadows with practiced ease. For a strange moment, I wondered what Maggie's face would look like on paper. The curve of her jaw, the steadiness of her eyes. I almost asked him to draw her, but what would I give him? A description from memory? No, it felt too fragile, too private. Instead, I walked on, letting the night take me where it pleased. The next day, I decided to leave the quarter behind. I boarded a streetcar heading toward the neighborhoods Maggie had spoken of in fragments. Places tied to her childhood. Places that might still echo with her footsteps. The ride was slow, the car rattling along tracks lined with oak trees draped in moss. Houses passed by, some elegant with tall columns, others worn down, paint peeling under years of humidity. I disembarked near Lafayette Cemetery, its gates standing solemn and ornate. The air was quiet here, save for the rustle of leaves. Tombs rose above the ground, cracked and leaning, their stone faces weathered but dignified. I wandered among them, reading names, feeling the weight of history pressing in. Somewhere nearby, families lived their daily lives. Children played, dogs barked. But here, time had stopped. I thought of Maggie again. She had mentioned Lafayette once, almost in passing, when she spoke of her father building a house. Was this the same place? Would she walk these streets when visiting her sister? I couldn't know, yet the thought of her being near lingered with every step. That evening, I returned to the riverfront. The Mississippi rolled by, wide and unhurried, its surface reflecting the soft glow of light strung along the levee. Street performers gathered again, dancers spinning to the beat of drums, a magician making coins vanish, children laughing at the tricks. I leaned against the railing, letting the noise wash over me, when I heard a sound that froze me in place. A laugh, not just any laugh, but one I recognized instantly. Gentle, low, carrying warmth even in its brevity. My heart jolted. I turned, scanning the crowd. And there she was, Maggie. She stood a short distance away, near a vendor selling roasted peanuts. Her shawl was still draped across her shoulders, though tonight she wore a blue dress beneath it. Beside her was a woman seated in a wheelchair, a blanket over her lap. I realized at once it must be her sister. For a moment, I hesitated. Should I approach? Would it feel like intrusion? But the decision seemed to make itself. I stepped forward, each pace measured, until I was close enough for her to notice me. She turned, and her eyes widened slightly in recognition. Then came a smile, faint at first, then blooming with genuine surprise. "You," she said, her voice carrying disbelief and warmth in equal measure. "Me," I replied, suddenly unsure what else to say. Her sister looked between us, curiosity flickering in her tired eyes. Maggie placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, then turned back to me. "I didn't expect to see you again," she admitted. "What are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same," I said, though my tone was softer, almost tentative. She glanced at her sister before answering. "I'm showing her the river. She always loved it, even when we were children." I nodded, shifting my gaze toward the water. "It's beautiful," I said, though I wasn't just speaking the river. There was a pause then, filled by the noise of the crowd around us. And yet, in that moment, the city seemed to fall away. It was just the three of us, two strangers reconnected, and a sister caught gently between. Maggie gestured to a nearby bench. "Sit with us," she said. So I did, and as the Mississippi flowed beside us, as music rose once more into the night, the long bus ride from Dallas began to feel less like an ending and more like the beginning of something neither of us had yet dared to name. The bus pushed steadily eastward, the rhythm of the wheels against the highway almost like a metronome guiding the thoughts in my head. Night had long since fallen, and the glass beside me was now a black mirror, showing only faint reflections of my face and the figure of Margaret beside me. She had drifted into silence again, her eyes half closed, though I could tell from the slight tension in her jaw that she was not sleeping. She was thinking, lost somewhere deep in her own past, or maybe in the possibilities of what waited ahead. I shifted in my seat, the worn fabric scratching against my arm. The air inside the bus carried that familiar blend of too much air conditioning, faint perfume, and a lingering smell of fast food someone had smuggled on board. People spoke in whispers. Some laughed quietly at the back, but most were cocooned in their private spaces. Headphones on, eyes closed, bodies leaning against windows or pillows. Margaret suddenly broke the silence, her voice low, as if she was sharing a secret not meant for anyone else. I used to take trips like this when I was much younger. Back when I thought every bus ride would lead me to something bigger, something that would change my life. Her words hung in the air. I glanced at her and saw the faintest smile curve her lips, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Did it?" I asked softly. She gave a small laugh, almost bitter but not entirely without warmth. "Sometimes. Other times it just led me back to where I started, only a little more tired than before." The honesty in her tone made me hesitate. I wanted to ask more, to pry deeper, but I sensed that she had offered as much as she was willing for the moment. Instead, I let the silence stretch between us, not uncomfortable, just present. The bus rumbled on. Outside, the highway lights grew sparse, replaced by the occasional flicker of a gas station or a lone diner with neon signs buzzing faintly against the night. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled, soft at first but growing louder as the minutes passed. A storm was building, the kind that felt inevitable on long southern nights. Margaret shifted, pulling her cardigan tighter around her shoulders. "Do you believe people meet for a reason?" she asked suddenly, turning to face me with those sharp, searching eyes. I blinked, caught off guard by the question. "I don't know. Sometimes it feels that way, doesn't it? Like all the little coincidences are lining up for something we can't see yet." She studied me for a long moment, her face unreadable. Then she nodded slowly. "Yes, that's exactly how it feels." The storm finally broke. Rain streaked the windows in diagonal lines, and the bus wipers swished back and forth in a steady rhythm, fighting to keep the glass clear. The sound was oddly soothing, a soft percussion against the steady hum of the engine. Inside the bus, people stirred, some pulling jackets tighter, others yawning as if the rain had lulled them further into sleep. Margaret leaned closer, her shoulder brushing lightly against mine. It wasn't intentional, or maybe it was, but the touch lingered. "You're going to New Orleans for the first time," she said, her voice nearly lost in the sound of the rain. "I want to show you something when we arrive. A place that meant a lot to me once. Maybe it will mean something to you, too." Her offer caught me by surprise, but there was something in the way she said it. Quiet, assured, almost like an invitation into a chapter of her life she rarely shared, that made me nod without hesitation. "I'd like that," I replied. The hours passed slowly after that. The storm raged and softened, leaving only wet roads glistening under the occasional glow of passing headlights. Margaret dozed off at last, her head tilted toward me, strands of her dark hair brushing against my arm. I sat still, not daring to move, letting the weight of her presence rest against me as the bus carried us closer to Louisiana. When dawn finally began to break, the horizon shifted from black to deep gray, then to faint shades of blue and pink. The world outside the window came alive again, trees dripping with rain, small houses set back from the road, and the occasional truck stop where tired travelers refueled. The bus slowed as we neared Baton Rouge, the driver announcing a brief rest stop. Margaret stirred awake, blinking against the early light. She looked at me for a moment, then smiled faintly, as though surprised I was still there beside her, though of course I had been all along. "Coffee?" she asked. "Definitely," I replied, my own voice hoarse from the long night. We stepped off the bus into the damp morning air. The parking lot smelled of wet asphalt and fried food, the kind of scent that clung stubbornly to clothes and skin. Inside the small cafe, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in an unflattering glow. Truck drivers sat hunched over their meals, sipping from oversized mugs, while families shepherded sleepy children toward the restrooms. Margaret and I ordered coffee, and for a brief moment it felt as though we weren't two strangers on a bus ride anymore. Sitting across from her at the plastic-top table, watching the steam rise from our cups, I felt a strange sense of familiarity, as if I had known her far longer than a handful of hours since we met. She wrapped her hands around the mug, warming her fingers. "I haven't been back to New Orleans in years," she said softly, more to herself than to me. "I left because I thought I had to, because sometimes the city swallows people whole. But maybe it gives them back too, in ways we don't expect." Her eyes lifted to meet mine, and in that moment I understood that whatever she was taking me to see later wasn't just a place. It was a piece of her story, something fragile yet important enough that she wanted to share it with a stranger who had happened to sit beside her on a long ride through the night. The driver called out for passengers to return to the bus. Margaret finished her coffee with one last sip, set the cup down, and rose from the table. "Come on," she said quietly. "We still got miles to go." And so we boarded again, carrying with us not just the weight of our luggage, but also the silent thread of something beginning, something neither of us could yet name, woven tightly into the rhythm of the road ahead. The road beyond Baton Rouge stretched like a ribbon of wet asphalt, glistening under the weak morning sun. The storm had moved eastward, leaving behind a sky streaked with pale orange and gray, as though dawn itself had been washed clean by the rain. The bus engine groaned as it pulled back on the highway, its tires hissing on the slick pavement. I settled into my seat again, still holding on to the lingering warmth of coffee and the quiet words Margaret had shared over that plastic-topped diner table. Margaret sat beside me, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her gaze fixed out the window. She didn't speak for several minutes, and I let the silence hang there, feeling it was somehow necessary. There was a weight in her presence, not burdensome, but thick with stories yet untold. The faint hum of the overhead lights, the soft snoring of a man 2 rows back, and the low murmur of the road created a kind of cocoon around us. It felt private, despite the dozen strangers sitting within arm's reach. As the bus curved along the freeway, Margaret finally broke the silence. "You know," she began, her voice quiet but steady, "when I was younger, I thought New Orleans was the center of the world. Every corner of that city had a secret. Every street played a song. But it's not always easy to live in a place that never stops singing. Sometimes the noise seeps into you, and you don't even realize how much it's changed you until you've left." Her words caught me, not just for their imagery, but for the hint of longing buried in them. I turned slightly toward her. "Do you miss it?" I asked. Her lips curved into a faint smile, though her eyes remained on the window. "Every day. And at the same time, not at all. It's complicated. Some places give you everything and take everything at once." The bus slowed as we approached another town, the highway narrowing into a strip line with weather-beaten billboards and small houses with porches that sagged just enough to show their years. People stirred in their seats, checking their watches or shifting as if the change of speed demanded they wake up. A child 2 rows had pressed her face to the glass, fogging it with breath as she pointed out a giant roadside sign advertising pecan pie and hot biscuits. Her mother hushed her gently, pulling the girl back to her seat. Margaret watched this small exchange, her face softening. "I used to travel with my daughter when she was little," she said suddenly. "She loved bus rides, thought they were adventures." She stopped there, her words clipped short, and for a moment I wondered if I had misheard her. But the flicker of emotion in her expression told me I hadn't. She didn't elaborate, and I didn't press her. Instead, I let her statement hang between us. Like a fragile thread, I was afraid to pull too hard. The bus pressed on, the morning rolling into midday. The air conditioning grew colder, forcing passengers to tug on sweaters or wrap themselves in thin blankets. Margaret slipped her cardigan back on and leaned slightly against the headrest. Her shoulder brushed mine again, and though neither of us acknowledged it, neither of us moved away. Hours blurred together in the monotony of the road. We passed small towns with names I could barely catch on the faded green highway signs, places that seemed to exist only as brief pauses on the way to somewhere else. Gas stations dotted the exits, each promising the same blend of lukewarm coffee, greasy food, and lottery tickets. The bus didn't stop, though. pushing steadily southward, as if drawn by some invisible thread pulling us toward the Gulf. By the time we reached the outskirts of New Orleans, the sun was tilting westward, painting the clouds in shades of rose and gold. The air outside had changed, too, warmer, heavier, carried with it the faint tang of salt and damp earth. Spanish moss hung like lace in the trees, and the highways were lined with waterlogged ditches where egrets stood motionless, waiting for prey. The city was close now, close enough that I could feel Margaret tense beside me, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her cardigan. When the skyline finally appeared, rising in uneven layers beyond the bridges and waterways, Margaret exhaled sharply. It wasn't quite relief, more like resignation, as though she had been bracing herself for this moment since we left Dallas. The bus rumbled across the Mississippi River Bridge, its massive steel frame arching above us. Below, the water churned brown and restless, catching glimmers of fading sunlight as barges drifted slowly downstream. The driver's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing that we would soon arrive at the New Orleans terminal. Passengers stirred, gathering their belongings, stretching stiff limbs, and exchanging quiet conversations. Margaret remained still, her gaze locked on the city as it drew closer. I watched her, sensing that this arrival carried far more weight for her than for anyone else on the bus. When we finally pulled into the terminal, the air shifted instantly. The moment the doors opened, a wave of humidity swept in, carried with it the scent of exhaust, fried food, and something faintly metallic from a nearby river. The terminal buzzed with movement. Travelers reuniting, drivers shouting destinations, and a constant shuffle of luggage wheels on concrete. It was chaotic, alive, and overwhelming after the long, controlled quiet of the road. Margaret stood, smoothing her cardigan as though preparing herself. She turned to me, her expression unreadable but intent. "Come with me," she said. It wasn't a request, not quite, but neither was a command. It felt more like an invitation into something she had already decided I was a part of. I hesitated only a second before nodding. "Where are we going?" I asked. She glanced at me, her eyes sharp yet softened by something I couldn't name. "You'll see. It's not far from here. I want to show you the place I mentioned." We stepped off the bus together, swallowed by the thick New Orleans air and the crush of people moving in every direction. The noise was constant. Honking horns outside, snippets of jazz bleeding from a radio somewhere, voices calling in English, Spanish, and the unmistakable lilt of Creole. It felt as though the city itself was alive, humming and breathing all around us. Margaret led the way, her pace brisk despite the heat. I followed, weaving through the crowd, my backpack heavy against my shoulders. As we moved farther from the terminal, the noise shifted, mellowed into the rhythm of the streets beyond. Buildings rose around us, old and weathered, their iron balconies draped with ferns and flags. The streets were narrow, paved with cracked stones, and the air smelled faintly of spices, damp wood, and something sweet I couldn't place. She stopped at a corner, turning to me with a faint smile. "This is the French Quarter," she said softly. "I used to live not far from here. The city changes, but this part never really does. It holds its stories close." We walked on, deeper into the quarter. Street musicians played on corners, their notes drifting through the air, trumpets, guitars, a saxophone carrying a tune that curled around us like smoke. Tourists laughed, snapping photos, while locals moved with practiced ease through the crowds. Every doorway seemed to hold another secret. A cafe, a voodoo shop, a bar glowing with neon signs. Margaret slowed as we reached a quieter street, one where the noise softened and the buildings loomed closer, their shutters half closed against the fading light. She stopped in front of an old building with peeling paint and a balcony that sagged slightly under the weight of its iron railings. For a moment she just stood there, her eyes fixed on it as though it might dissolve as she blinked. "This," she said finally, her voice low, "was my home, a long time ago." I looked at the building, then back at her, sensing the gravity in her words. She reached out, brushing her fingers against the chipped doorframe as though it were a relic, something sacred. Her hand lingered there, trembling slightly, and I realized that whatever story she was about to share was one she hadn't spoken aloud in years. I didn't say anything. I simply stood beside her, waiting, letting the city hum quietly around us while Margaret gathered the pieces of her past to lay before me. Margaret's fingers lingered against the doorframe of the old building, her hand trembling slightly as though she feared it might vanish if she let go. The paint was faded, chipped down to the wood in places where rain and heat had worked their slow destruction. Above us, the balcony sagged, iron railings curling in ornate designs dulled by rust. The shutters were half broken, their once vivid green now a muted shade of moss. It was a kind of building you could pass without a second glance, just another forgotten relic among countless others in the quarter. Yet to Margaret it was a landmark, a piece of her soul carved into the bones of the city. She exhaled, slow and uneven. I lived here when I was 20. Fresh out of school, no money, but so much hope. It felt like the world started here. Like if I just stayed long enough, something magical would happen. Her eyes flicked up to the balcony as though replaying scenes only she could see. I stayed quiet, letting her words flow without interruption. There was music every night, she continued, from the bar down the street. I'd sit up there, lean on the railing, and let the sound wash over me. Sometimes it was jazz, sometimes blues, sometimes just the drunken songs of strangers. I thought it was beautiful then. I thought everything was beautiful, even when I was broke and hungry. She paused, her lips pressing into a thin line. I was married here, too. Not for long. He was a musician. Of course. They always are. Charismatic, restless, always chasing something just out of reach. I believed in him more than I believed in myself. And then one day he was gone. Took his guitar, his promises, and left me with nothing but this place and a head full of echoes. Her words fell heavy, not with bitterness, but with the weary weight of memory. I felt the urge to say something comforting, yet nothing seemed right. So I did the only thing I could. I stayed beside her, silent, listening. She finally pulled her hand back from the doorframe, tucking it into the pocket of her cardigan. I haven't been back here in more than 20 years. Funny, isn't it? To carry a place in your head for so long, only to find it still standing when you finally return. The street around us was quiet compared to the chaos of suburban a few blocks away. A stray cat padded across the cobblestones, pausing to glance at us before disappearing into the shadows. From somewhere distant, a trumpet wailed a mournful tune, the notes bending with raw emotion. It fit the moment, too, perfectly, like the city itself was responding to Margaret's confession. She turned to me suddenly, her eyes sharp. Do you believe places remember us? The question startled me, though it carried the same tone she had used earlier on the bus, when she asked if people met for a reason. I thought about it, about the way certain rooms seem to hum with old energy, how you can walk into a house and feel laughter or sadness lingering in the walls. Yes, I said finally, I think they do. Maybe not in the way we remember them, but in their own way, like they hold on to pieces of us. She studied me for a moment, then nodded slowly. That's what I was afraid of, that this place would still remember me. We stood there in silence for a while longer, the city moving around us, alive and unbothered by our stillness. The sun had slipped lower, shadows stretching across the street, lanterns beginning to flicker on in iron holders attached to the walls. The quarter transformed at dusk, shedding its daytime calm for something more electric, more unpredictable. Voices grew louder, laughter spilled from open doorways, and the music grew closer, more insistent. Margaret drew in a long breath, as though shaking herself free from the weight of the past. Come on, she said, turning away from the old building. There's somewhere else I want to take you, somewhere less haunted. We walked deeper into the quarter, weaving through narrow streets that curved unexpectedly, revealing courtyards hidden behind wrought iron gates. Vines crawled up walls, ferns spilled over balconies, and the smell of food drifted from every corner. Spices, fried seafood, sugar dusting from fresh beignet. Street performers gathered small crowds, their drums and guitars echoing off the stone, while fortune tellers set up tables beneath umbrellas, their tarot cards spread in careful patterns. The energy was overwhelming, almost intoxicating, and I could see the city's pull in every passerby's eyes. Yet beside me, Margaret seemed both part of it and apart from it, her steps sure, but her gaze distant. We eventually emerged into Jackson Square. where artists displayed their work along the iron fences, their canvases splashed with vivid colors of bayous, jazz bands, and Mardi Gras parades. The cathedral loomed white against the darkening sky, its spires sharp, its bells tolling the hour. Children ran across the open space, chasing pigeons while their parents sipped coffee from paper cups. Margaret stopped near the center of the square, her face softening as she looked up at the cathedral. "I used to sit here for hours," she said quietly. "Back when life felt like it had no direction. I'd watch the artists, the tourists, the street preachers. Everyone seemed to have a role, a reason to be here. I'd sit and wonder what mine was." She lowered herself onto a bench, motioning for me to join her. I did, the wood warm beneath me from the day's sun. She folded her hands in her lap, staring out at the square with a distant expression. "I brought my daughter here once," she murmured. She was only 6. She loved the pigeons, chased them until her cheeks turned red. She told me she wanted to be a painter, like the artists who set up along the fence. I told her she could be anything she wanted, and for a moment I actually believed it. Her voice cracked on the last word, so faint I almost missed it. She blinked rapidly, her jaw tightening as though she was determined not to let the emotion spill over. I hesitated and asked softly, "Where is she now?" Margaret's eyes flicked toward me, then back to the cathedral. For a long moment, I thought she wouldn't answer. Finally, she said, "Far away. That's all you need to know right now." I nodded, respecting the boundary, though curiosity tugged at me. There was pain in her words, but also a wall she wasn't ready to lower. The square grew busier as the evening settled in. Lights strung across nearby patios blinked to life, casting a warm glow on the crowd. Musicians gathered near the fountain, their instruments tuning, preparing to fill the night with rhythm. The scent of food grew stronger, a mix of gumbo, roasted meat, and powdered sugar wafting through the air. Margaret rose from the bench, smoothing her cardigan. "Come on," she said again, softer this time. "The night is just beginning here. If you really want to know New Orleans, you have to see it after dark." I followed her, the square fading behind us as we slipped into a side street glowing with lantern light. The sound of jazz spilled from a bar ahead, horns and drums colliding in a joyful cacophony. The doors were open, revealing a crowded room where people swayed to the rhythm, their faces lit with laughter and drink. Margaret paused at the entrance, her expression unreadable. Then, without a word, she stepped inside. I hesitated only a moment before following her into the pulse of the music, into the heart of the city that seemed to know her as much as she knew it. The night was only beginning, and I sensed that whatever stories Margaret had carried with her on that long bus ride from Dallas were about to unfold here, in the glow and chaos of New Orleans. The bar swallowed us the moment we stepped inside. It was narrow and dim, its walls lined with old posters curling at the edges, announcing shows from years gone by. The air smelled of smoke, beer, and something fried drifting from the kitchen and back. Lanterns hung low, their glass shades tinted amber, throwing a warm haze over the crowded room. The stage sat in the corner, barely raised, yet the musicians standing there held the crowd with a magnetic pull. A trumpet gleamed under the lights. A saxophone's brass caught the glow, and the upright bass stood tall like a sentinel, its strings vibrating through the floor. Margaret paused just inside, her eyes adjusting. She looked different here, less guarded, though not entirely free. Her steps slowed as if she were moving through a memory, her gaze drifting over faces, tables, corners of the room that had likely not changed much in decades. She led me toward a small table near the back, its surface scarred with carvings of initials and circles left by countless glasses. We sat, the chairs creaking beneath us, and the music wrapped itself around us like a tide. The band launched into a lively number, horns bright, drums quick, the singer's voice raw and full of soul. People clapped along. Some stood to dance in the narrow space between tables, their movements loose, unself-conscious, as if the music itself pulled them into motion. A couple at the bar leaned close, laughing, their hands finding each other in the chaos of sound. An old man with a weathered hat tapped his cane against the floor in time with the beat, his face lit with the glow of a memory only he knew. Margaret tapped her fingers against the table, almost imperceptibly, keeping rhythm. She wasn't smiling, but her expression softened in a way I hadn't seen before. "This city," she said quietly, almost lost under the music, "it has a way of pulling you back into yourself, even when you don't want it to." I leaned closer to hear her. "Is that why you stayed away so long?" Her eyes flicked toward me, sharp and searching. "Yes, and no. I stayed away because I was afraid of what it would remind me of, afraid of who I was when I lived here. But maybe," she added, her voice dropping, "I was afraid it would feel too much like home." Her gaze shifted back to the stage, where the trumpet wailed in a high, aching note that seemed to stretch the length of the room. She closed her eyes briefly, as though letting the sound wash over her. When she opened them again, there was something in her expression I couldn't quite name. Nostalgia, sorrow, maybe even a kind of relief. A waitress slid by, balancing a tray heavy with drinks. Margaret ordered a whiskey neat, her voice steady, and I followed with the same. When the glasses arrived, their rims sweating in the humid air, she lifted hers in a small, almost private toast. "To the things we run from," she said softly, then tipped the glass back, swallowing with a practiced ease. The whiskey burned, sharp at first, then warm, settling into me like a quiet fire. Margaret set her glass down, her fingers tracing the rim absent-mindedly. "I used to sing in a place like this," she said suddenly, her eyes fixed not on me but on the stage. "Not well, not professionally. But sometimes, late at night, they'd let me up there. I thought maybe music would save me, like it saved some people. But it didn't. Not really." I studied her face, the way her jaw tightened slightly, the way her eyes lingered on the singer as though watching a younger version of herself. "What did you sing?" I asked. She laughed, a short sound, dry but not unkind. "Anything they'd let me. Old standards, blues, songs I barely knew but thought I could fake my way through. It wasn't about being good. It was about being heard." The band shifted into a slower tune then, the saxophone carrying a long, low melody that curled like smoke around the room. Couples drew closer on the makeshift dance floor, swaying, their faces inches apart. The air thickened with something unspoken, a longing carried by the music itself. Margaret's eyes softened, and for a moment she looked almost vulnerable, her guard lowered in the dim light. She leaned closer, her voice low. "You know what the hardest part of leaving the city was? It wasn't the people. It wasn't even the memories. It was the silence. Other places are too quiet. Here, even in pain, there's always sound, always life pressing against you." I nodded slowly, trying to imagine her years away, carrying the hum of the city inside her, only to find silence where she landed. I wanted to ask where she had gone, what kind of life she had built, but I held back, sensing the story would come in its own time. We sat through another set, the music weaving around us, lifting the room into applause after each number. Margaret drank slowly, her fingers never far from her glass, though her eyes grew brighter with each sip. When the band paused for a break, she leaned back in her chair, exhaling deeply. "Let's walk," she said suddenly. "I want you to see the city at night, not just through music, but through the streets. That's where the real heartbeat is." We left the bar, stepping into air that was thick with humidity and the faint scent of river water. The quarter had transformed completely. Strings of lights crisscrossed above narrow streets, glowing softly against the dark sky. Musicians played on corners, drummers using overturned buckets, violinists coaxing sweet notes that floated above the chatter. Laughter spilled from balconies where people leaned over railings, drinks in hand, beads hanging from their necks, though it wasn't Mardi Gras. Margaret walked with purpose, her steps sure despite the uneven cobblestones. I followed, watching the way her presence seemed to shift here. She was no longer just a woman carrying memories. She was part of the city's rhythm, her body moving in time with its pulse. We passed a tarot reader seated beneath an umbrella, her table lit by candles, cards spread in neat patterns. Margaret slowed but didn't stop, her gaze lingering just long enough to show hesitation before she shook her head and kept walking. A brass band thundered from the next corner, their trumpets blaring, their drums pounding, and a crowd danced wildly in the street. Margaret smiled faintly at the chaos, though she didn't join it. Eventually, we slipped down a quieter lane, where the noise dimmed to a low hum behind us. The street was lined with shuttered shops, their windows dark, their signs swaying gently in the night breeze. Spanish moss draped from the trees overhead, casting long shadows across the stones. Here the city felt older, heavier, its secrets pressed tight into the walls. Margaret slowed, her hand brushing against the rough brick of a building as we passed. "I lost myself here once," she said softly, almost to herself. "And I found myself again, both in the same night." I wanted to ask what she meant, but before I could, she turned to me, her eyes catching the faint glow of the street lamp. "Do you ever feel like your life has been following a map you never saw? Like you're just now realizing all the lines were leading you here?" Her words sank into me, heavy and electric at once. I opened my mouth to answer, but for a moment no sound came. The city around us hummed, alive and endless, as if it too was waiting for my reply. We walked on to quiet streets, the hum of New Orleans fading behind us, but never truly gone, as if the city itself had imprinted its rhythm onto our steps. Margaret's gaze lingered on the river in the distance, the water dark and restless beneath the faint glow of streetlights, and I realized that our journey was not just about a bus ride or city, but about the stories we carry, the memories we cannot leave behind, and the fragile connections we make along the way. In that moment, I understood that some journeys do not have an ending. They unfold quietly, in the spaces between conversations, in the music that lingers long after the notes have faded, in the shared silences that say more than words ever could. And as we continued walking side by side into the night, I felt that whatever awaited us, whether revelation, reconciliation, or simply another moment of quiet understanding, it would be a part of this story, this city, and this long, winding path that had brought us together.